So I am now going to introduce Sarah, who is down here. Sarah's going to introduce herself. She's got a very interesting recent background.
Thank you. So first I'll introduce myself. My name is Sarah. I'm here with the Country Land and Business Association, or CLA. You're probably wondering why this Canadian is speaking to you today. So I've been in the UK about 10 years now. My master's is from Harper Adams University. I have experience working in local national government. So I was working in the Cabinet Office for COP26, advising the Mayor of London on climate change, as well as on environmental issues. And so I'm really excited to be at the CLA working with landowners and farmers, which is more what my degree was on at Harper Adams. So today, as Gary mentioned, we'll be talking about natural capital. Should we be doing anything? That's a really good question. If I was going to give you one word, I would say maybe, but I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to say a bit more than that today. So a bit of an overview of what I'll be trying to cover in 20 minutes. So really quickly, what do we mean by natural capital? What are the opportunities? How to access the markets? What are the risks? And what you can do now. So what are we talking about when we say natural capital? There's a lot of jargon that's out there. You might have heard environmental markets, offsetting, nature-based solutions. But really, at its simplest, a natural capital approach is thinking of nature as an asset or a set of assets. Things like soil, air, water, woodlands, for example. These natural assets can generate value in the same way that other assets can. So think of natural assets a bit like the assets you have in your farm, maybe farm buildings, farm machinery, you might have staff, etc. So we get services from natural capital from a natural capital approach. So something like soil, it's a medium for growing crops, for storing carbon and water regulation. So that's the services that it provides. Now, what your natural capital services are worth will really depend on the quality, quantity, and location of them. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about a few of some of the government and business drivers and why there's this emergence of environmental markets. Because natural capital isn't a new concept, but suddenly everyone's hearing about these different markets that could potentially bring them profit. So there's significant changes, as you know, to farming policy with the phasing out of the basic payment scheme. And alongside this, there's rising farm costs, whether it's fuel, fertilizer, and many other things. So as a result, many landowners, I'm sure there are many in the room today, you're probably thinking, can I get a new source of income through a natural capital approach on my farm? What would the CLA would say? It is a possible new approach, it is a possible source of income, but it's no gold rush and it's not necessarily right for everyone. So the first driver is legislation. So right now there's quite a few pieces of legislation that have come out recently. The most important one being the Environment Act with environmental targets so that the country can try and reach net zero by 2050. But within the Environment Act, there's things such as biodiversity net gain and a lot of other regulations that now through ELMS and through other programs, farms are going to have to try and meet. All land is going to have to try and meet. And the government's going to try and figure out how to get everyone to contribute to meet those targets. So another driver is regulation. So as I've mentioned, there's biodiversity net gain. There's also nutrient neutrality and mandatory financial disclosures for a lot of businesses. And then finally, there's business responsibility. So businesses might want to voluntarily show that they're doing something for the environment, for their reputation, for example, or they might want to do something through regulation. So biodiversity net gain, they might have to do something for the environment. So this has led to the development of environmental markets because they want to kind of offset the damage they're doing. And so there could be damage via carbon emissions or damage to habitats. So probably thinking what types of environmental markets are out there. Well, there's three main ones. There's the ones that we all know. So there's the government schemes, so such as environmental land management schemes. The second one are the offset markets. So that would be carbon, biodiversity net gain, and nutrient neutrality as the main ones. And then responsible business. So those could be retailers, brands, or water companies. So many water companies, for example, are already paying farmers and land managers to reduce water pollution in catchment areas. And then quickly, in terms of the government schemes, this is usually the first entry point into environmental markets for landowners and farmers. So agri-environment schemes are actually the lower risk and more familiar approach than anything the private sector has to offer. I'm sure you're aware of all the different schemes that are available, so I won't get into too much detail about these. I'm sure you probably know more about them than I do. If anything, you could tell me. You could talk for days about all the different things that you're doing on your land through those schemes. So the environmental offset market, so that market exists really to compensate for unavoidable impacts on the environment and valuable species and ecosystems. So a business like a housing developer, for example, it's inevitable for them to have some environmental impact when they're building a house on land. So offsetting is this kind of way of balancing those negative impacts through positive actions. So some businesses will do offsetting voluntarily. So that could be through carbon credits, for example, through a voluntary carbon market. And others will engage in offsetting due to regulation. So they might have to offset because of nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain. It's relevant for everyone here today because these environmental markets do present a potential opportunity for farmers and land managers to have an additional income stream from their natural capital assets. However, the private sector funding does need more consideration than most government funding would. And the reason for this is because private sector funding, there's two main, I'd say, characteristics, and they're much longer term contracts, and they usually take place at a much larger scale. So a lot more of your land would have to go into them. Which is, I guess, my way of saying it's a much higher risk. So the next slide. And then, so the next one is about responsible business. So businesses who want to reduce their impact and improve their image, as I said, will go through a range of channels to do so. An example would be water company Severn-Trent. So they have an environmental protection scheme, and this includes a catchment management program. So that gives farmers opportunity to apply for funding specifically for tree and hedge planting, as well as enhancing habitats. There are quite a few water companies in the UK that are doing this. So there's not really, as far as I'm aware, one place that lists every single possible opportunity with water companies, but you'll be aware of the water companies in your local area. And you can get in touch with them and find out what they have available for farmers and landowners, and whether or not they're going to have a scheme upcoming, because with nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, and stricter regulations that are coming through the Environment Act, they will probably have to do more to, I suppose, clean up their pollution. So next I'm going to talk about what the opportunities are. So I've mentioned government funding. So that's going, at the moment, it's around 500 million per year in England, but that's going to go up to 2 billion. That's not actually enough to reverse and fund nature recovery and climate change mitigation based on the targets that the government has set. So the private sector funding will actually be crucial for this. So for biodiversity net gain offsetting, the value is not clear, but it will depend on the site and what the possible gains are. So, for example, a blanket bog is a rare habitat, whereas enclosed farmland is not, so they will have different values. So you might need 6 hectares of farmland to equal 1 hectare of rare blanket bog, for example. So at the moment it's estimated that every year there'll be about 5,000 to 6,000 hectares. Sorry, mine's not in acres, I didn't know. But hopefully we can do the math for hectares. So about 5,000 to 6,000 hectares will be needed every year for biodiversity net gain, offsetting by developers and other companies. For nutrient neutrality, this one isn't known. However, Natural England is coming up with a nutrient mitigation scheme, and it's estimated those contracts will be 80 to 120 years long, and a lot of them will be just land purchases. And finally, there's the carbon sequestration one. So the voluntary carbon market, the value is really difficult to define, and there's a lot of varying numbers that people have heard. Part of the reason for this is there's a lack of confidence in the approach to measurement and assessment techniques to produce the results for carbon. So this, alongside some of the lack of carbon market regulations, means it's a bit of an unpredictable option. But despite being a slightly unpredictable option, I'll still briefly talk about it. So when carbon credits are purchased, it's usually by organizations for voluntary use rather than any kind of legally binding emission reduction obligations. So their markets are, so it's definitely a growing market, and there's a lot of demand for businesses to kind of offset their emissions and say that they're net zero. So this might include projects such as reforestation projects, wetland management, and peatland restoration. So from a landowner perspective, it's the most established, I guess, kind of market at the moment out of them, but it's still probably the most volatile one since it's not based on any kind of specific government legislation. The woodland creation through the Woodland Carbon Code is one that has been kind of approved and backed by approved by government. So that's probably the most reliable of the possible approaches to carbon credits. There is a big cost, however, to entering the carbon market. The cover for administration and verification processes is quite significant. So it wouldn't be worth planting more than anything less than 500. Less than 5 hectares for woodland within the Woodland Carbon Code for it to be just financially viable. There are a number of kind of market operators that are offering different contractual models to make it viable for smaller blocks. So it could be that several kind of groups of landowners and farmers could join together to try and make up this 5 hectares together. But again, then if you're in an aggregated block like that, you'll need to seek a lot of tax and legal advice to find out how those contracts could actually work and what kind of company you'd have to form with other landowners to actually get approved for carbon credits. Next slide. So for biodiversity net gain, so there's still some uncertainty around this. So it's going to be mandatory in November 2023. However, the regulations and guidances from the government still haven't come out yet. So there's kind of a lot of uncertainty about how it's actually going to work in practice. But the idea of biodiversity net gain is an approach to development that leaves the environment in a better state than it was before. So any kind of projects that are going to happen from November of this year means that there has to be 10% biodiversity net gain. So it can't just be replacing what you have. It has to be a measurable 10% improvement of the habitat or whatever it is that you lost from your building site. So that'll be measured through a biodiversity metric which DEFRA has created, and they're going to be actually publishing a new one pretty soon, or an updated one. And these habitats will need to be secured for at least 30 years. So this means it is a potential income opportunity for 30 years. And in some situations, some low-input farming will actually be possible on biodiversity net gain land. There's a few things to consider, though. If you're thinking about having biodiversity net gain on your land. So you'll need to think about land valuations, about hiring an ecologist, because the biodiversity net gain does require very specialist understanding of land and of ecosystems and the ecology. So to actually make sure that you have the right measurements and that you're delivering, that will be quite expensive. There's the tenancy terms, whether someone's buying your land, whether you're leasing it or planning to manage it as well, which will affect tax and liabilities, and as well what happens at the end of 30 years. So I'm speaking to someone just a few minutes ago before I started, and I said, well, at the end of 30 years, if you've planted a woodland, the government isn't, when it's trying to reach nature coverage targets, it's not going to want you to plow that up and cut that down, but the income's going to stop after 30 years. So you have to ask yourself, well, then how do I make it profitable after 30 years? What do I then do with that land? So those are the kind of questions that if a developer approaches you, a broker wants to connect you with the developer for your land to be put towards biodiversity net gain, you have to think, what happens after 30 years? And then, so for nutrient neutrality, how am I doing for time, by the way? I'm doing okay? Okay, perfect.
Slides.
Yeah, just Oh, maybe 4. Okay. And then for nutrient neutrality, as you probably know, it's offsetting, so where there's been excess nutrients. So this has been, so at the moment there's a lot of a backlog in terms of homes being granted planning permission and other buildings in affected areas. And because of that, the government set up a nutrient mitigation scheme. And as I did mention before, it will essentially fund the purchase of land for about 80 to 120 years. So mitigation strategies can include the introduction of new wetlands, retrofitting of sustainable urban drainage systems, or making arable farmland fallow to reduce nitrates. So next I'll briefly go over how to access the markets. So the first thing that's really important is preparation. So to start, you would need to do a natural capital assessment of your land, and that's beginning by identifying the natural capital assessments you have. So you want to kind of quantify that spatially. So that's thinking about the area of different assets on the land. So at the most basic level, what I'm trying to say is that you want to map the different land types. So you want to think about woodland, grassland, water bodies, etc. So a simple list or map of the natural capital assets will give you that foundation, that understanding. You don't need to go to a specialist to get that information. You'll be able to know what's on your land. And then once those assets have been identified, you want to think about other information, such as their condition. You want to think, what's the soil type? What are the species that are here? What's the habitat data? What available information do I have? And then think about what benefits do they provide to the business or wider society. So do they provide carbon storage? Do they provide flood management? You want a balance sheet giving natural capital values and costs. So think about costs of maintaining these assets, or how to actually enhance their value. So these are all things you want to think about and that you will be able to do yourself without having to spend much capital. A way to kind of expand your natural capital knowledge is by working with local experts. You can work with volunteers, wildlife groups, who will often be happy to help in terms of the looking at the ecology of your land. Farmer clusters are a great way for knowledge sharing, and I'd say that another place to look is actually local authorities. I know they're not necessarily always our favorite people to speak to, but they're currently developing local nature recovery strategies. If you're not aware of what those are, those will be kind of biodiversity and habitat maps for every local area in the UK. So there's going to be 48 responsible authorities developing these. They're going to have a huge amount of information. They'll be looking at habitat records, biodiversity records. They'll be bringing a lot of planning maps together. So they'll be able to really set out what are all the habitats that are in the UK, where should planning take place, where should nature recovery take place. And by speaking to local authorities who will have that information, it's really helpful to maybe understand, well, oh, the farm next to me has this, and land manager a few miles away has that, and kind of understanding really what the context is and what might be the best thing for you to try and develop in terms of your natural capital. As well as speaking to tax and legal specialists to understand which of the environmental markets are best for you, what it will mean for your land, and what it will mean for tax if some of it goes into biodiversity net gain through a lease versus biodiversity net gain that might be managed by yourself. So finally, so for accessing the market, so there's buyers, so you can work directly with buyers, so that might be developers and local businesses. Working with brokers and advisors who will be able to connect you with habitat banks and organizations that are selling maybe carbon credits or want to buy carbon credits. And then you can speak to landowners and specialists who might actually be kind of involved in some sort of environmental market. And so you'll kind of get an idea from someone who's doing it on the ground and kind of see if it's right for you. So the CLA has a number of resources for its members at the moment. So we have quite a few things that go into detail on whether it's carbon markets, nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, etc. That CLA members can have to look at if they want to kind of do a deep dive in anything I've spoke about today. So just a quick thank you, and it should say, and any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think the answer was maybe, was it?
Yeah.
Should you be doing anything? Okay. So I don't know whether you got that message or whether you understand that message. So thank you very much, Sarah. So any questions or comments? I think I think I have had a couple of questions. Does anybody want to say a few words about your thoughts on what we do? Most of our clients are doing, as I said, doing nothing. Are there any questions for Sarah? Oh, Emma, thank you. Yeah. No.
Oh, I think there's
so
a mic coming
we
for
have
you.
a microphone coming round. Okay, so if there's a question after Emma, you go first. Thank you.
Sarah, you had a slide up on there that said responsible business. Obviously, we've got a lot of business owners in the room. The farmers and landowners themselves are generally business owners. So what do you see the long-term implications being of selling credits, BNG, carbon, whatever it may be, if that business itself isn't as responsible as it could be, shall we say?
So if I understand your question, are you wondering if, say, you as a landowner, for example, would you want to sell credits from your land to a business, or are you saying businesses in the room are looking maybe to buy credits, but those businesses aren't?
No, if you were looking to
Yeah.
sell yourself,
Yeah.
but you yourself say aren't carbon neutral.
Yeah, so if you're looking to sell yourself, but you're not carbon neutral, for example, I mean, what's really kind of interesting at the moment, and why I would say it's a maybe, is because there's a lot of things that aren't ironed out by the government at the moment, that are where the regulations aren't clear. So that's part of what they'll be doing in the new green finance strategy that's coming out. They're going to put a kind of clear market framework, clear guidances around this, which will really help kind of drive the market. Because at the moment, there are organizations that will say, I'm going to buy your carbon credits for, like, don't look at what's happening in the background here, or can you sell me some? And I'm going to sell them to an organization that's who knows kind of what kind of pollution they're doing. So I'd say at the moment it's a bit of a wild west in some ways, and so some organizations might not be net zero themselves, and other organizations might be willing to pay them to have something that's kind of carbon neutral on one part of their land, and the other part of their land that might not be the case. Whereas, for example, if, I don't know, you're selling something like wheat, it might actually have to be net zero if that business wants the supply chain to be net zero. So it actually, for every single circumstance, and I appreciate this might not be a very simple answer, but for every single circumstance, it's probably going to be different, because whatever each land manager is doing is different, but each organization and business you're working with is also going to have kind of potentially different standards, different needs, different clients, etc. So all those things need to be taken into account when you're thinking of that. And some of them might be trying to offset businesses that aren't doing very good things. And your business might not be perfect, but some might be willing to turn a blind eye, some might not. So it again, because there's a lack of standards at the moment, it really depends.
Thank you.
So Sarah, it's unregulated at the moment is the problem. So when, as a CLA, how is the CLA lobbying to get the market regulated? Because once the market gets regulated, I guess we're in a lot better place. As you mentioned, we're in the carbon cowboy land basically. Until we get regulation, we've got a part regulation on woodland, but till we get the carbon part and soil regulated. So when do you think we will get regulated?
So I think that's going to start when the green finance strategy comes out later this year. So the government's promised that, and they're saying, right, we're going to be putting the $2 billion a year into ELMS. That's not enough to fund nature recovery. So we need to make sure that the private sector is ready to fund this, or else we're not going to meet our targets. Yeah. Now, whether or not they'll be able to get enough private finance going to meet those targets is another question, but they want to see that work, and that's in there. They're going to outline, well, this is how we want it to work, and they're even suggesting, they've suggested in the Environment Improvement Plan, which came out last month, they said that they want to even have maybe a voluntary biodiversity credit system, but that's something that they want to come out with that we're waiting to see what it means. Alongside that, there's the biodiversity net gain requirement that's coming out in November. So I'd say that right now it's a bit like we're in a legislative and regulation airport. You're kind of you've arrived somewhere and you're waiting to go somewhere else, but you're kind of stuck there waiting for the next thing to happen, which will be really interesting and great once you get on the plane and go. But you're just wondering, well, what's it actually going to say? What's it going to be? So we're, I guess, natural capital airport at the moment.
Natural capital airport. Okay, you heard it here. So, Paul, did you want to say? So,
I'll say something.
yeah, we'll get the microphone. Thanks.
Sarah, thank you very much.
Do you want to introduce yourself? Sorry,
I'm Paul Christian from Century.
Century
Hi.
Farming.
I've got a personal problem with this. I think most of us in the room have planted trees in our lives, and we did it for the next generation. And we can measure trees and we can count them. Carbon, we just don't know enough about it, but it seems to be taking an awful lot of time and space. Mm-hmm. And I think we perhaps ought to look at it for the future as well. And the BNG, I guess, similar thoughts. I just thought there's a lot of anxiety around at the moment, and when someone tells you there's an opportunity, it builds anxiety if you're not tapping into that opportunity. So, I think you've answered the question, but should we really be doing anything at this time whilst it's still very, very unknown?
Well, I would say that it's really important. Well, as I said, it's a maybe. It's because there are a lot of risks. There's going to be changes to regulation, and I would say that for some people they might think, well, actually, I've been doing all this kind of positive stuff for the environment on my land already, so how do I show additionality when it's already there? So one of the things about biodiversity net gain is that the metric is based on existing records of biodiversity that exists. So someone can't go and trash their land and then say, look at all the additional good stuff that's happening now on my land through biodiversity net gain. So there is that level of prevention, but there is an issue of, well, if I've already done all this good stuff, I'm not building like a new wetland or something. I've already got one. So how can I get paid for managing that? And so there's part of this, these environmental markets, they're quite young. You have organizations like Nature Finance, Environment Bank, they're all doing different things. And there's a lot of innovation in this sector. And what we're hoping to see is more organizations that want to pay land managers to maintain the good that they've already done, instead of just trying to find places where nature isn't good. We need to reward where nature is happening already, because I'm sure there's a lot of that on people's land in this room. So,
good. Thanks, Sarah. So, and our tax team who are here. So it's Luke, Chrissy at the back, and Sam here. Are all, well, perhaps you're not struggling, but you're all trying to think about how to tax. And there's no guidance on taxing BNG and carbon, etc. But we are dealing with quite a lot of BNG actually. That's a live market, and that's happening. I don't know how we've seen many transactions actually, but we're near to transactions and some big numbers we're dealing with as well in BNG. BNG is quite different because it's Environment Act, although we haven't got the detail through. Completely different to carbon. I just noted one point in your note. There's no value in stored carbon, which you put up there, which probably summarises it quite well, I guess. So we need to move on. So Sarah's going to be here all the rest of the day, rest of the evening. And so thank you very much, Sarah. Can we thank Sarah, please, for... One more point.
If you did have a question or your hand up and we weren't able to get to you, my colleague Claire is at the CLA banner, so you could always give her the question in your name and we can try and answer that for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah.